Hey dear restless mind, tonight imagine a quiet courtyard deep in the heart of a walled city. The lanterns burn low, perfumed smoke coils from braziers, and somewhere nearby the faint scrape of a lute echoes in the dusk. The air smells of roasted chestnuts, damp stone, and faintly of something sharper, herbs soaked in rice wine to dull pain. A cluster of women sits in the shadows, their embroidered slippers lined neatly beside them, yet none of them is truly walking anywhere. Their feet, hidden beneath silk, are already bound. You'd probably never make it through a single medieval night, but don't worry, I'll guide you safely through. So, before we go any further, if this quiet company helps, you can gently tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from, maybe lying awake in New York or drifting in a quiet room in London. Drop your time and place below, so none of us feel alone tonight. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey. Together, here on Timeless Sleep. The custom of foot binding began in the Song dynasty, and for nearly 1,000 years it reshaped the very idea of beauty in China. Imagine a girl of 5 or 6, barely steady on her legs, taken by her mother or grandmother and placed on a stool. Warm cloths are ready, bandages cut long and thin, and a bowl of herbs set nearby to ward off infection. The little girl may think she's being prepared for a celebration, until the first toe is folded down beneath her sole. Bones are pressed, bent, snapped. The arch is forced higher, then the binding wrapped tighter. A process designed not to heal, but to deform. The child screams, her tears mixing with the scent of medicinal oils. Yet in the family's eyes, this is not cruelty. It is preparation for her future. The goal was the golden lotus, a foot measuring no more than 7 to 9 centimetres, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, small enough to signal elegance, fragility and submission. Walking became a shuffle, a sway, a deliberate teetering movement considered alluring. Pain was constant. Bones ground against one another, flesh broke open, nails pierced into skin. Sometimes infection set in, sometimes toes blackened and fell off, and yet families celebrated. A daughter with lotus feet was a daughter with prospects. A girl who refused risked becoming unmarriageable, condemned to spin silk or carry water while others married into wealth. Archaeologists and historians today look at the shoes, tiny, impossibly narrow, embroidered with phoenixes or peonies, and see relics of torture disguised as fashion. But in their time, these shoes were treasures. Mothers saved them in chests, daughters stitched them with pride. The feet themselves were hidden, rarely shown even to husbands. It was not the sight of the feet, but the gait of the woman, the delicate step, the slight sway, that was thought irresistible. In a society where restraint was beauty, crippling was seen as refinement. Consider how this practice endured. For centuries dynasties rose and fell, borders shifted, philosophies flourished, and still women sat in courtyards binding the next generation's feet. When Western travellers first saw them, they recoiled, yet locals shrugged. It was as ordinary as combing hair. Some women, asked later why they endured, replied with a mix of resignation and pride. To refuse would have been unthinkable. The same hands that stitched embroidery for weddings also pulled the bandages tight, believing they were weaving their daughters' futures. It was not simply vanity. It was tied to economics and class. Landowners and scholars wanted wives who would not work in fields. A woman with crippled feet was proof of her family's wealth. She need not labour, she could focus on refinement. Like long fingernails centuries later, lotus feet announced privilege. Poorer families sometimes bound their daughters' feet too, hoping to marry them upward. If you think of it, it was like sending a resume, except instead of listing skills, you erased the ability to walk. There were even manuals, poems and guides celebrating the practice. Writers described the eroticism of a woman's swaying step, compared lotus feet to delicate blossoms, and even praised the sound of embroidered shoes tapping along the floor. A cruel paradox. The very pain that crippled women was also what gave them status. Men spoke of bound feet as golden lotuses, yet the reality was bones warped and flesh scarred. One of the most bizarre aspects was that bound feet were rarely revealed. Husbands sometimes never saw them bare. Instead, the shoes themselves became symbols of intimacy. Exchanging, touching, or even glimpsing the tiny slippers could be as charged as romance. Imagine falling in love not with a person's actual body, but with the idea of a shoe. It's like modern dating profiles, but instead of filters, you just cropped out the part that was mangled. Some women, despite the pain, took ownership of their lotus feet. They crafted shoes with elaborate embroidery, bright silks, hidden charms stitched into the lining. Each pair was a message, a piece of identity, even rebellion. In some regions, young women exchanged shoes as tokens of friendship or affection. The shoes survived when the feet could not. Today, museum collections of these tiny slippers sit like tragic fairy tale relics. Cinderella's glass slipper shrunk down and blood-stained. The irony, of course, is that while women were crippled in the name of beauty, the society around them was flourishing in philosophy, invention, and governance. Paper, gunpowder, and compasses transformed the world, yet in countless homes, mothers tightened bandages around their daughters' toes. The contradiction is staggering. Imagine inventing fireworks for festivals while also inventing new ways to hobble half the population. There's also the strange allure of gait. Writers praised the lotus step, describing how a bound-footed woman walked with swaying hips, leaning slightly side to side. To men, it was mesmerizing. To women, it was the only way to move forward. A shuffle became poetry, pain became performance. Think of it like this. If high heels today make walking painful but fashionable, imagine extending that principle to an entire life. At least with stilettos you can take them off. And yet, bound feet also became a space of quiet resistance. Women confined indoors often created rich inner worlds. They read, embroidered, painted, and composed poetry. Some even wrote about their pain in veiled metaphors. A lotus blossom in a poem might really be a cry for freedom. Foot binding both erased mobility and created spaces where women cultivated culture. Trapped bodies, liberated minds. It's the cruel irony that the very act meant to suppress them also gave rise to subtle voices that survived in art. By the late 19th century, reformers began to push back. Missionaries, activists, and Chinese intellectuals decried the practice. Anti-foot-binding societies formed, swearing not to marry bound-footed women, urging families to let their daughters walk freely. Yet resistance met with ridicule. Many still believed unbound feet were shameful. Even into the 20th century, women hid their natural feet under long skirts. Habits of 1,000 years do not vanish overnight. Some elderly women alive today, in remote parts of China, still carry their lotus feet. Photographs show them sitting with dignity, embroidered shoes on their shrunken feet, faces lined with age. They embody a past both brutal and beautiful. Survivors of a world where pain was considered elegance. When asked, some shrug with resignation. It was our fate. Others admit bitterness, recalling childhood stolen by bandages. But all carry the weight of a tradition that crippled millions yet defined a civilization's idea of womanhood. Imagine walking through that courtyard again, hearing the shuffle of embroidered shoes on stone, the soft sighs of women sitting with folded hands. Beauty, in this world, was pain. Status was measured in centimeters, and every step left an invisible trail of history. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it still. The tap of silk slippers across time, echoing like a lullaby both haunting and strange. The night deepens, and in the palace, shadows lengthen across lacquered floors polished so smooth they mirror the lantern light like shallow water. The air here is heavy with incense, sandalwood, musk, a faint sweetness that clings to silk sleeves. Beyond the carved doors of jade and bronze lies a world no commoner could ever imagine, the Emperor's harem. Yet this was not some loose collection of lovers. It was a system structured as carefully as an army, guided by numerology and ritual, with rules as intricate as the brushstrokes of calligraphy. Each whisper, each embrace, even each breath of the Son of Heaven was recorded like state policy. According to tradition, numbers held cosmic significance. 3 represented male strength, 9 magnified it, 27 reached toward divine perfection. So the harem was arranged accordingly. 1 empress, 3 noble consorts, 9 middle consorts, 27 junior consorts, and 81 concubines. Add them all together, and you had a small town of women whose sole purpose was to surround the emperor. Imagine attending family holiday dinners with hundreds of relatives, except everyone's main goal is to charm the same person. That's not just awkward, that's bureaucracy with perfume. Every evening followed protocol. Officials, not the emperor himself, selected the night's companion. The chosen woman was bathed, oiled, combed and perfumed like an offering. She wore no jewellery, lest it scratch imperial skin, and was carried, literally carried, into the chamber. Not in a dignified sedan chair either, but often on a small quilt held by eunuchs. Picture the awkwardness of being lugged around like an oversized takeout order, and yet this was the height of honour. When she entered, her name was called, the time announced, and everything logged in official registers. Yes, even the most intimate details became paperwork. Scribes noted whether intimacy occurred, whether the emperor completed the act, and, brace yourself, even whether he ejaculated. To them it wasn't embarrassing, it was governance. The emperor's body was a national resource, and his output a matter of state importance. Imagine HR keeping records like that. Forget sick days used. Here it was more like emissions logged. Attendants observed the lunar phases, aligning encounters with cosmic cycles. Yin and yang were balanced, not just in philosophy but in bed. The emperor's fertility, health, and even political stability were tied to these nightly rituals. If he strayed from the schedule, heaven might grow angry, so the man with absolute power still had to follow a bedtime calendar like a student cramming for exams. And what of the women? For them, entry into the harem could mean glory or despair. A single night might elevate a girl's family to wealth, or condemn her to lifelong obscurity if she was never chosen again. They lived in gilded isolation, competing with each other while serving a master they rarely saw. Rivalries brewed. Poisonings, whispered accusations, even staged accidents occurred in those silk-draped halls. The palace was not a romance, it was reality television with higher stakes. The empress reigned over them, but she too was bound by etiquette. She could not veto the emperor's choices, though she supervised the hierarchy. A senior consort might wield influence one year, then fall into disgrace the next, replaced by a younger rival. Imagine working in an office where promotions depend on whether your boss happens to like your perfume, and whether the stars agree. Eunuchs enforced the system. These were the gatekeepers, the ones who prepared, reported, and monitored. They escorted women into chambers, rolled up bedding afterward, and sometimes inspected evidence to verify intimacy occurred. Yes, inspected. If you think your boss micromanages, imagine having co-workers literally check your sheets. Eunuchs were the human firewall of the harem, ensuring no outsider tainted the imperial line. Their castration, brutal as it was, gave them unique access to secrets they could wield as weapons in palace politics. For the emperor, the system could feel less like luxury and more like duty. Chronicles describe rulers who groaned under the weight of scheduled encounters. Imagine being too tired after a day of decrees, yet still told, "Sorry, Your Majesty, but the junior concubine in slot 27 has been waiting 6 months. It's her turn." Skipping wasn't allowed. Heaven might disapprove. So the emperor submitted, not just to women, but to cosmic bookkeeping. Some emperors embraced it with zeal. Tang Taizong reportedly enjoyed the pageantry, treating each night as both state ritual and personal pleasure. Others, like the last Ming emperor, grew exhausted and resentful, viewing the harem less as delight and more as a suffocating cage of expectations. You might think absolute power means freedom, but even emperors had bedtime scheduled by committee. The records themselves still survive in dusty archives, lists of names, times, encounters. They read less like diaries and more like shipping logs. One can imagine future historians chuckling over entries like Consort Liu, second watch, intercourse complete. It's the ancient equivalent of keeping receipts, except they were receipts for intimacy. And yet, for all its absurdity, the system carried serious weight. Dynasties depended on heirs, and heirs depended on recorded legitimacy. If a concubine bore a child, the logs proved the emperor was indeed the father. No paternity tests, just bureaucratic paperwork blessed by eunuchs. Without those records, succession disputes could tear the empire apart. In a sense, the fate of China sometimes rested on whether someone remembered to file the bedroom paperwork correctly. The women themselves cultivated strategies. Some studied music, poetry, or dance to catch the emperor's eye. Others relied on family alliances, Powerful clans bribed eunuchs to promote their daughters. Some even prayed to gods or bribed astrologers for favourable omens. Still, luck reigned supreme. Being chosen once could change everything. Being ignored forever meant living out decades behind gilded screens, fading into anonymity. The palace was both paradise and prison, its beauty laced with despair. Think of the sheer surrealism. An emperor's intimacy timed with moon phases, logged by scribes, enforced by eunuchs, and infused with cosmic meaning. Love had little place in it. Duty overshadowed desire. For some women, the emperor was a stranger they met once, yet they were bound to him for life. For others, the harem became a battlefield, each smile a weapon, each glance a risk. And beneath it all was the sense of theatre. The emperor's chamber was not just a private space, it was a stage upon which the empire's destiny played out. Every embrace was a ritual, every child a political pawn, every sigh a note in the symphony of dynastic survival. Imagine living in a world where your bedtime story was written not by your heart, but by your horoscope and your filing cabinet. In that palace, silence weighed heavier than gold, and perfume masked fear as much as allure. 1,000 embroidered slippers whispered across corridors, carrying women to a destiny chosen not by love but by arithmetic. And as the moon waxed and waned above the tiled roofs, the empire's pulse followed, beating to the rhythm of schedules, registers, and rituals that transformed intimacy into bureaucracy. The palace doors close behind us now, and the setting shifts. Imagine instead the low creak of bamboo huts in the damp southern provinces, where the scent of mud mixes with smoke from cooking fires. Dogs bark in the distance, children chase each other barefoot, and a pig snorts contentedly in its pen. Except this pen isn't just a pen, it's a bathroom too. Welcome to the strange invention known as the pig toilet. Yes, a toilet and a pigsty rolled into one, proving once again that ancient China had a genius for efficiency, and also for ideas that make you wince before dinner. Picture it. A wooden shack with a plank floor, a neat round hole cut directly above the pig's enclosure. When someone in the household felt nature's call, they simply squatted over the hole. Gravity did the rest. Down below, the pig grunted happily, tail flicking, and got on with its strange meal plan. No need for cesspits, no shoveling waste, no worrying about the smell lingering around the house. The pig handled everything instantly. It was zero-waste living, centuries before the term became trendy. Who needs eco-toilets when you've got pork-based recycling? The practicality was undeniable. Food scraps from the kitchen, weeds from the fields, and yes, human waste all went to the same place. The pig grew fat, and in time the family had pork for festivals. The cycle was complete. People fed the pig fed on people's leavings, and then the pig fed the people. Talk about farm to table, except here it was stomach to stomach. Some modern environmentalists might call it circular economy. Everyone else would probably call it disgusting. To villagers, though, it was normal. Poverty-shaped custom. When families had little, they used everything. To waste was unthinkable. You can almost imagine a grandmother scolding a child. Don't you dare complain, the pig's hungry too. The animal was both garbage disposal and future banquet. In a way, it solved two problems, sanitation and sustenance. Toilets without plumbing, pigs without fodder. 2 birds, 1 stone, or rather 2 meals, 1 poop. Travellers from wealthier regions recoiled when they first saw it. Records describe them refusing to eat pork in villages with pig toilets, certain the taste must carry traces of what the pigs had consumed. Villagers just laughed. To them the meat tasted fine, and besides, what alternative did outsiders suggest? Building fancy cesspits in clay soil, paying for feed when weeds and waste were free? The pig toilet worked, and that was what mattered. Even more astonishing is how long this practice survived. Archaeological and ethnographic records suggest pig toilets existed not only in ancient times, but well into the 20th century in poorer provinces. Imagine stepping into a rural village in the 1930s and finding children giggling as they toss corn husks into a pigsty that doubles as the bathroom. No one thought it shameful. It was practical. If anything, it was considered clever husbandry. The setup was simple but ingenious. A ladder sometimes led to the latrine hole. A bamboo trough angled waste into the pen if direct dropping wasn't possible. Families might even build a small roof over the pigsty to protect both pig and Well, payload from rain. Hygiene as we think of it wasn't the goal, convenience was. And if the pig seemed to thrive, the family felt reassured. Never mind modern germ theory. The pig toilet was proof that somehow life continued. Of course, pigs became more than just livestock in this context. They were essential partners in survival. A fat pig could be traded, sold, or sacrificed at festivals. The fact that it had eaten human waste was almost irrelevant. To poor peasants, meat was meat, and survival outranked squeamishness. Think of it like this. If modern people drink coffee brewed from beans digested by civet cats and pay extra for it, perhaps we shouldn't judge too harshly. At least the villagers didn't market their pork as artisanal. The pig toilet also created some awkward side effects. Disease did spread in certain regions, especially parasites like roundworms and tapeworms. Families noticed, but without understanding microbiology, they blamed spirits or weather instead. Doctors prescribed herbs, shamans performed rituals, yet the root of the problem remained in the backyard pigsty. Still, the cycle was too useful to abandon. A family might lose a child to fever, mourn, and then step back onto the same toilet the next day. Tragedy and pragmatism coexisted, as they often did in peasant life. From another perspective, though, this custom reveals the brilliance of resourcefulness. It shows how human beings, pressed by necessity, devise solutions that outsiders find revolting, but insiders consider normal. For them, it wasn't filth, it was frugality. They lived by cycles, seed to soil, grain to stomach, waste to pig, pig to feast. In a sense, it was a philosophy of completeness, a rustic yin and yang where nothing was wasted. The stomach of the pig balanced the stomach of the family. Harmony, albeit a rather smelly one. The pig toilet also became woven into folklore. In some tales, mischievous children threatened each other with being fed to the pig. In others, clever wives mocked lazy husbands by comparing them to animals who lived off others' leavings. Some superstitions even claimed pigs raised this way brought luck, because they embodied abundance, eating endlessly and giving back meat in return. A grotesque kind of generosity. For modern ears, the thought of it inspires gag reflexes. Imagine inviting a guest over for dinner and casually pointing to the backyard. That pork roast? Yes, he was our toilet last month. Hospitality takes on a whole new meaning, but context matters. In times when famine haunted the land, when every kernel of millet was precious, pig toilets were lifelines. They were the reason some families made it through harsh winters. When weighed against starvation, disgust became irrelevant. There's an odd echo of this in contemporary experiments with biogas toilets, where human waste is used to produce energy. Today we dress it up with technical jargon and green labels. Back then they dressed it up with bamboo walls and a fattened pig. The principle isn't so different, making use of what would otherwise be discarded. The main difference is, thankfully, we don't eat the generator afterward. And let's not forget the pig's perspective. From the animal's point of view, this was probably paradise. Endless food supply, no one chasing you with a stick unless festival season approached, and a cosy pen to wallow in. Sure, the menu was unconventional, but pigs aren't exactly picky eaters. If pigs could write restaurant reviews, these would probably be 5 stars. Never goes hungry, service is immediate, flavour eclectic. In some ways, the pig toilet reveals the stark contrast between palace luxury and peasant practicality. While emperors tracked intimate encounters with cosmic numerology, villagers tracked nothing but whether the pig was still squealing. 2 sides of the same civilization, one obsessed with celestial order, the other with earthly survival, both equally strange to our modern sensibilities. So as you sit in comfort, imagining yourself perched above a contented pig, ask yourself, would you have used it? In their world, it was as ordinary as brushing teeth is to ours. Disgust is relative. What shocks one age sustains another. And somewhere, in the quiet of those villages, the snorts of pigs beneath toilets were the soundtrack of survival. The smell of smoke clings to the rafters of the forbidden city, though the air itself is sweet with sandalwood and lotus incense. In the echoing corridors, shadows slide across vermilion walls where gilded dragons coil around doorways like silent guards. Past the courtyards and through endless gates lies a world that many men dreamed of entering, but only the most desperate ever achieved. The world of the eunuchs. Strange as it may sound, some families willingly sent their sons into this fate, believing that cutting away a future might ironically open doors to power. In imperial China, eunuchs were not merely attendants, they were fixtures of authority. They controlled access to the emperor, whispered secrets into royal ears, and moved like shadows across the bureaucracy. Without them, the palace could not function. To become one, a boy had to undergo castration, often at a tender age. The procedure was crude and dangerous, done without modern tools or anaesthetics. Relatives, even fathers, sometimes carried it out themselves with knives sterilised only by fire. Survival was uncertain. Some boys bled to death. Others lingered in agony, feverish and infected. Yet if the boy lived, his life took a new path. He was now purified, suitable for service inside the palace's most guarded spaces. It wasn't always punishment. In fact, more often it was ambition. Poor families desperate for status or survival saw the path of the eunuch as a gamble. A son could never produce heirs, but he might achieve wealth, influence, or even power greater than any farmer or merchant could dream of. Imagine sitting around a village fire, parents weighing whether to maim their child for a chance at fortune. The logic is grim. Sacrifice one part of the body, gain everything else. Once inside, the eunuch joined a hierarchy as elaborate as the emperor's harem. Some tended gardens, some kept archives, others handled food or clothing. But the highest among them, the trusted confidants, controlled imperial secrets. They delivered reports, carried whispers, even oversaw the schedules of the emperor's bedchamber. Their loyalty was expected to be absolute, for without family, they had no lineage, no clan to serve. The emperor became their father, the palace their home. In theory, eunuchs were servants. In practice, they became power brokers. By the Ming dynasty, their influence was so vast that ministers of state trembled before them. A eunuch without a surname could dismiss a nobleman with centuries of lineage. Whisper the wrong word, and you might vanish into prison or execution, not because the emperor decreed it, but because his eunuch suggested it. They were the hidden hand guiding decisions, the shadow rulers behind silk curtains. Their rise was fueled by access. While ministers waited outside in formal halls, eunuchs lingered beside the emperor's bed, his dining table, his bath. They knew his moods, his secrets, even his weaknesses. They could hide letters, deliver false news, or block visitors. Imagine trying to influence the emperor, only to discover your plea vanishes in the eunuch's sleeve before it ever reaches his desk. It's like sending an email to your boss only to have IT quietly delete it. The physical changes eunuchs endured shaped their identity. Their voices often became higher, their bodies less muscular. Without testosterone, some grew plump, others frail. Their presence was unmistakable. Some wore their difference proudly, flaunting embroidered robes and gold rings to signal their wealth. Others leaned into humility, heads shaved smooth, their voices low and deliberate as if to counter the caricatures whispered about them. But all shared one defining mark, the absence of heirs. Their lives ended with themselves. No family graves awaited their bones. Instead, many built lavish tombs in advance, monuments to their own names since no sons would honour them. Historians recall eunuchs both infamous and legendary. One, Wei Zhongxian of the Ming dynasty, effectively ran the empire for years. He filled offices with loyal allies, executed rivals, and even had temples erected in his honour. People called him 9,000 years, an echo of the title reserved for emperors themselves, who were addressed as 10,000 years. Another eunuch, Zheng He, became an admiral commanding massive treasure fleets that sailed as far as Africa. Picture a man denied family leading armadas across the oceans. His lack became the empire's expansion. The paradox is haunting. To gain power, a man had to lose the very thing that defined lineage in Chinese culture, the continuation of family. Ancestor worship lay at the heart of society, yet eunuchs cut themselves off from it. They could not pass on incense at family altars, could not see their name engraved on ancestral tablets, and still they thrived in the palace, rewriting their worth through influence rather than bloodline. In a culture obsessed with heritage, eunuchs became proof that sometimes power itself was enough to outlive family. For the emperor, they were both indispensable and dangerous. Too many dynasties ended weakened by eunuch cliques, corrupt and self-serving. Yet emperors could not do without them. Who else could be trusted to guard the harem, where no intact man was allowed? Who else would serve without distraction of family ties? Each emperor tried reforms, some limited their numbers, others executed whole groups in purges. But like weeds, eunuchs always returned, growing again in the cracks of imperial power. Life for ordinary eunuchs was less glamorous. Many spent decades cleaning, fetching, or guarding doors. They endured ridicule, even abuse from palace women or higher officials. The palace could be a gilded cage where they aged without notice. Some died penniless, their bodies buried outside city walls. Others scraped together savings, funding small temples or charities as their legacy. Between the extremes of admirals and tyrants lay thousands of forgotten servants, whose lives were measured in silent obedience. Despite their ambiguous role, eunuchs became symbols of loyalty in literature. Plays and novels often depicted them as cunning tricksters or tragic figures, caught between devotion and betrayal. The stage eunuch was both comic relief and dark reminder. A man who gave everything for power, only to be mistrusted by everyone. Audiences laughed, but nervously aware that such figures still lingered in the palace, shaping events from behind screens. And there were practical ironies too. Eunuchs often managed imperial harems, arranging schedules for women they themselves could never touch. Imagine controlling the most intimate details of 1,000 concubines' lives while personally excluded from desire. The cruelty of it is staggering, yet perhaps it gave them a clarity others lacked. They served not for pleasure, but for proximity to power. Even their preserved evidence became part of law. In some cases, the severed parts were kept in jars believed necessary for burial so that the eunuch might be whole in the afterlife. Tales abound of eunuchs hiding their jars carefully, fearing theft or loss. It sounds grotesque, but in a culture where wholeness mattered for the soul's journey, even fragments of flesh became talismans of hope. Imagine spending your life guarding a jar, as if eternity itself depended on it. In the quiet hours of night, one can picture them. Eunuchs pacing corridors lit by lanterns, their soft shoes whispering across tiles. Their faces unreadable, their voices calm, yet their minds alive with schemes and secrets. They were both less than men and more than men, diminished in body but magnified in influence. To the empire they were indispensable. To themselves they were survivors of a bargain that cost flesh but bought history. And so, in the tapestry of ancient China, eunuchs stand as one of the most shocking norms. Not monsters, not saints, but living contradictions. Proof that in pursuit of power, societies often demand sacrifices that look unthinkable from the outside. To the villagers, the pig toilet was survival. To the emperor, eunuchs were survival. And in both cases, the price of endurance was strangeness we can hardly fathom today. The hush of the palace falls away, and now the streets fill with the clamour of markets, vendors shouting prices for ginger and silk, children darting between stalls, beggars stretching bowls toward passers-by. Yet beneath the noise runs a thread of fear, a silence that coils around a single syllable, the emperor's name. In ancient China, this name was not a label, but a sacred possession, guarded more fiercely than jewels. To speak it aloud was unthinkable, to write it incorrectly was dangerous, and to ignore the taboo could mean death. Imagine living in a world where even the wrong word in a poem might drag you before a judge. The practice was called bihui, the avoidance of names. On the surface, it was reverence, a way of honouring the Son of Heaven as, above all mortals. But in truth, it was also fear, an invisible leash binding every subject. If the emperor's given name contained a character, that character vanished from everyday use. Families with surnames that matched it sometimes had to change them. Books, songs, even signboards in markets had to be altered. A slip of the brush could turn loyalty into treason. Picture a scribe late at night, his brush hovering over rice paper, copying records by candlelight. The flame flickers, the ink bleeds, and by accident he writes the forbidden character. He freezes, staring at the mark. Does he scrape the paper and risk leaving a trace? Does he throw the sheet away and hope no one finds it? Either way, his future trembles in that single stroke. A mistake here isn't a typo, it's a potential execution notice. Modern autocorrect may humiliate you, but at least it won't kill you. The lengths to which people went bordered on absurd. When the Emperor Zhao reigned, the character Zhao, meaning bright, became untouchable. Suddenly poems that used the word for sunlight had to be rewritten. Children named Zhao had to be renamed. Imagine being told overnight, "Sorry, your name is illegal now, pick another one." It's the ultimate identity theft, sanctioned not by hackers but by heaven. Officials lived in constant dread. Every report to the throne required meticulous avoidance. Calligraphers, men trained for decades in the art of perfect brushstrokes, sometimes trembled so hard they ruined the page. Entire careers could vanish in a blot of ink. One slip, one forgotten stroke, and you might find yourself beaten in public, stripped of your rank or quietly executed. The emperor's name was more feared than a sword. You could dodge a blade, but you could not dodge a word already spoken. Ordinary people weren't spared either. In taverns, storytellers skipped phrases that sounded too similar to the forbidden name. Songs lost verses, jokes lost punchlines, all to avoid offence. It warped language itself, shaping how people expressed ideas. Some historians argue that whole cultural expressions disappeared because of this. Think of it as the ancient version of censorship, except instead of government committees with red pens, the censor was one syllable that belonged to one man. There's a recorded case where a family refused to write their ancestral surname because it matched a reigning emperor's character. They changed it to something similar, altering their lineage in the process. Generations later, their descendants no longer bore the name of their ancestors, all because one emperor centuries back had claimed exclusive rights to a word. Imagine your family tree chopped and grafted because the king didn't like hearing his own name echoed in your dinner conversations. Of course, some exploited the system. Clever courtiers used the taboo to accuse rivals. Whisper, he used the forbidden character, and suddenly, your enemy faced interrogation. Evidence hardly mattered. The accusation itself carried weight. A scribe's ink could be tested, a scholar's scroll burned, and in the end, a family destroyed over nothing more than a word. It was collective paranoia disguised as loyalty. The fear trickled into education too. Teachers warned children never to utter certain characters. Young boys learning calligraphy practiced avoidance before they even learned grammar. Think of the oddity. Classrooms where a child raises his hand and asks, "Teacher, how do we say the sun?" only to be told, "Not that word, not this year." Language itself bent around the emperor like bamboo in the wind. For emperors, the taboo was a way to magnify distance between ruler and ruled. Names connect humans to each other. By making his own name unspeakable, the emperor became untouchable, almost divine. He was a man, yes, but he was also an abstraction, a symbol too powerful for ordinary tongues. It was a psychological trick as much as a legal one. Break bones if you must, but breaking words keeps fear alive in every conversation. And yet, not all emperors enforced it equally. Some were lenient, allowing minor slips to go unpunished. Others were ruthless. During the Tang dynasty, an official was executed for leaving out a single brushstroke in the emperor's name. Think about that. An entire life ended not for treason, not for rebellion, but for a shaky wrist. In modern terms, it's like being put on trial for forgetting to capitalize your boss's last name in an email. There were even creative workarounds. Writers developed alternate phrases, poetic substitutes, and clever metaphors to dance around the forbidden words. Some texts became riddles of avoidance, their meaning bent into strange shapes. Scholars later puzzled over them, wondering why so many synonyms piled up in the same place. The answer was simple: survival. Better to write awkwardly than to write too well and die for it. The strangeness of it lingers when you realize how deeply it infiltrated lives. Lovers writing poems to each other avoided characters that resembled imperial names. Farmers naming oxen or fields hesitated over the wrong syllables. Even jokes between friends could be curtailed by the shadow of the taboo. Words, once free, became shackles. The emperor didn't just rule land and people, he ruled language itself. And yet, here's the irony. For all their effort to guard their names, emperors often died like ordinary men, poisoned by elixirs, toppled by rebellion, undone by their own courtiers. The name that once silenced millions eventually became just another entry in a chronicle, pronounced by historians, spoken by tourists, printed in textbooks. The very thing men once died for is now muttered casually in classrooms. If emperors could hear their once forbidden names on the lips of schoolchildren today, they might roll in their tombs, or perhaps laugh at the futility of it all. Still, in its time, the taboo was deadly serious. Imagine being a poet, your life's work the brush and the page, and realizing that one character in your language could erase not just your poem but your existence. It gave every word weight, every syllable sharpness. The brush became as dangerous as the sword. There's a chilling beauty to it too, the idea that a name, just ink and sound, could shape an empire's rhythm. It's a reminder of how fragile freedom of speech really is. Strip away a word, then another, until silence fills the gaps. In ancient China, silence itself became a kind of obedience, echoing louder than protest. So next time you curse autocorrect for changing duck to something less polite, remember the scribes who lost their lives over a misplaced stroke. They didn't just fear embarrassment, they feared execution. And in that fear, the emperor's power became complete. His armies held cities, his ministers ran governments, but his name ruled every tongue. In the markets, people whispered carefully, sidestepping sounds. In schools, children hesitated over brushstrokes. In courts, officials trembled as they recited reports. All because one man's name was sacred property. In a world of shocking customs, this one may be the strangest. Not a mutilation of the body, but a mutilation of speech itself, slicing words from mouths before they could even form. The lanterns dim, the markets quiet, and we drift again into the hushed chambers of belief, rooms filled with scrolls, jade figurines, and the acrid scent of burned incense. Here, in the soft glow of lamplight, Taoist alchemists whisper teachings of immortality. Their voices lower, as if the walls themselves might blush, and they speak of fangzhongshu, the art of the bedchamber. According to these teachings, male vitality, yang, was finite. Every emission was seen as a leak in the body's cosmic reservoir. Female energy, yin, was considered abundant, nourishing, and absorbable. The conclusion? To live longer, a man must sleep beside women, ideally young virgins, and refrain from climax. The idea sounds like a cross between a wellness retreat and a very awkward group project. Chronicles describe emperors who surrounded themselves with teenagers, not purely for desire but for a promise of longevity. Picture a ruler stretched out on silken bedding, young girls arranged around him like petals in a human lotus. Some were there to touch, some simply to lie close, their bodies believed to radiate vitality that the emperor could drink in through the skin. It wasn't romance, it wasn't even intimacy. It was biology reimagined as ritual, like plugging your phone into a human charger. The language of Taoist texts was ornate. They spoke of returning the jade essence, gathering the dew, and circulating the dragon's breath. Translated bluntly, don't spill it, absorb hers instead. Manuals outlined breathing exercises, positions and techniques. The goal wasn't pleasure, it was preservation. To climax was to shorten your life. To hold back was to grow in power, drawing yin into your marrow until you shone with the glow of immortality. At least, that was the theory. In practice, most emperors died early, exhausted from endless attempts to supplement yang through yin. It turns out overdosing on virgins isn't exactly a life-extending strategy. For the girls, the experience was surreal. Many were chosen young, taken from families with the promise of honour. They entered the palace expecting privilege, only to discover they were living tonics in a human apothecary. Some never engaged in intercourse at all, merely sleeping beside the emperor to transfer energy. Imagine being told as a teenager, lie quietly next to His Majesty so he can live forever. Forget algebra homework, that's an assignment no one signs up for. The rituals weren't only about lying still. Some girls were instructed to touch specific parts of the emperor's body, aligning yin with certain meridians. One text suggested that pressing a virgin's hand to the emperor's chest could extend his heartbeat, while resting her head on his abdomen might stabilize the dragon's cauldron. If that sounds vague, it's because vagueness was part of the mystique. When you can't prove immortality, you may as well wrap it in poetic metaphor. And then there was the calendar. Taoist alchemy insisted timing mattered. Nights under certain moon phases were considered potent. Spring encounters renewed energy, autumn ones preserved it. Some emperors kept astrologers on retainer just to map when yin was most absorbable. Imagine a royal assistant leaning in. Sire, the stars say tonight is excellent for not climaxing. Also, avoid pork. Even bureaucracy in the bedroom returned. Of course, the dangers were real. Seeking eternal life, emperors consumed tonics made of mercury, arsenic and powdered jade, while also exhausting themselves in nightly bedchamber marathons. Some collapsed from overexertion, others poisoned themselves slowly. The irony is sharp. The pursuit of immortality often hastened death. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, famously died from mercury pills meant to grant eternal youth. Later rulers followed the same path, proving once again that bad science plus absolute power equals early funerals. Still, the faith persisted. Why? Because to abandon it was to accept mortality. And emperors, raised as sons of heaven, couldn't stomach the idea of dying like ordinary mortals. Virgins became their talismans. Taoist masters, whether sincere mystics or opportunistic conmen, encouraged the practice. After all, if the emperor lived longer, they kept their patronage. If he died, well, clearly he hadn't absorbed enough yin. The logic was conveniently unfalsifiable. For the empire, this obsession had consequences. Girls were pulled from villages, leaving families both honoured and terrified. Some returned years later, aged by palace life, unable to marry. Others never returned at all. Their youth was consumed not by marriage or work, but by serving as human batteries for rulers who feared the grave. The cruelty is quieter than execution, but no less haunting, and yet among the emperor's subjects the practice gained a strange allure. Stories circulated of men who lived longer by following bedchamber arts, avoiding emission while boasting vitality in old age. Manuals filtered into common hands, turning Taoist theory into bedroom advice. Husbands tried to imitate emperors, wives rolled their eyes, and households discovered that chasing immortality through intimacy mostly led to disappointment. Still, the myth endured, because who doesn't want to believe life can be prolonged by something as simple as lying still? The contradictions pile up. A civilization that invented compasses and fireworks also believed teenagers could be human life support machines. Emperors who commanded armies and reshaped landscapes trembled before wrinkles and grey hair. Power could conquer nations, but not time, so they sought to rewrite biology, turning girls into medicine and desire into mathematics. The result was predictable: exhaustion, scandal, and dynasties weakened by rulers too busy chasing eternity to govern properly. One story tells of an emperor who kept 300 virgins in his palace, rotating them like a living apothecary shelf. He believed that constant access to yin would keep his yang inexhaustible. Instead, he wasted away, sickly and pale, before dying in his 40s. Courtiers whispered that he had over-supplemented, a delicate way of saying he tried to live forever and burned out instead. Another emperor demanded virgins as tribute from provinces, leaving resentment in his wake. Even in death, his legacy was not his conquests, but his insatiable search for youth. To modern ears, it sounds absurd, almost comical. Imagine a CEO today announcing a corporate wellness program based on absorbing intern energy. HR would combust. Yet in its time, this was science cloaked in mysticism, backed by centuries of Taoist philosophy. Yin and yang weren't just metaphors, they were the operating system of the cosmos. To manipulate them was to rewrite destiny. If the price was bizarre ritual, so be it. For the girls, silence was survival. To resist was unthinkable. Some may have found solace in luxury, silks, food, protection from the harshness of village life. Others likely felt trapped, their futures stolen. A few became concubines, elevated by imperial favour. Most remained nameless, their bodies reduced to footnotes in the emperor's quest for eternity. Their absence in records is its own kind of silence, one that echoes louder than chronicles of emperors' failures. And so, in the dim palace halls, night after night, emperors lay surrounded by youth, convinced they were drawing life into themselves while time, relentless and unseen, continued its march. Every sigh, every touch, every withheld breath was logged in records and calendars, but none of it stopped the inevitable. The emperors died, the virgins aged, dynasties crumbled, and immortality remained out of reach. What lingers is the absurdity, the strange conviction that eternity could be stolen from innocence, that youth could be bottled like wine and consumed in silence. It's shocking not because it failed, but because it lasted so long, generation after generation repeating the same desperate ritual. And perhaps the most haunting thought of all is that for those emperors, it was not strange at all. It was normal, expected, necessary. In the endless list of ancient China's customs, this one glows strangely. Emperors lying in silk, virgins curled at their sides, moonlight filtering through lattice windows, all in the hope of beating back time, a ritual both intimate and absurd, tender and cruel. beautiful in its poetry yet grotesque in its reality. Tonight, you can almost hear the whispers of Taoist masters, the rustle of silk sheets, and the quiet desperation of rulers who, for all their power, were just as mortal as the peasants who used pig toilets. The moonlight fades behind clouds, and the palace walls seem to tighten, as though listening to the cries from a judgment hall. In ancient China, law was not just about justice, it was about theatre, about warnings etched into flesh, about punishments so vivid that they lingered in the imagination long after the sentence was carried out. Among the most infamous were the so-called 5 punishments, a system codified and reshaped across dynasties, but always terrifying in practice. These weren't fines, lectures, or community service. They were mutilations, designed not only to correct but to display, to carve shame into the body itself. Imagine standing in a dusty courtyard, flanked by officials in black robes, the magistrate reading your crime aloud while villagers crowd in silence. Theft, exile breaking, rebellion. Words that sound ordinary until the sentence falls. Hands severed, feet removed, body left incomplete. For minor theft, fingers might go. For larger crimes, entire hands. Attempted escape could cost your feet. And for rebellion, or striking against authority, the whole body might be dismembered piece by piece, leaving only a torso. These punishments were not accidents. They were deliberate acts of state, calculated to turn a criminal into a permanent reminder. The philosophy behind it was harsh, but clear. If a man's hands stole, cut them off. If his feet ran from exile, remove them. If his body rebelled against the throne, strip it of form altogether. The punishment matched the crime, or so officials claimed. But in truth it was less about balance and more about control. It sent a message. You are nothing without the state's permission, not even whole. Some victims died on the spot, bleeding out in the dust. Others survived, patched together with herbal poultices and bandages, stumbling through the rest of their lives as living warnings. They were called wuxing, formless ones, bodies with essential parts missing. And society did not pity them. Quite the opposite. People were forbidden to assist them in public. A man without feet could crawl across a market street while onlookers turned away. To help him would be to defy the law's purpose. His suffering was supposed to be seen, not soothed. Consider the horror of such isolation. Not only were you mutilated, but you were erased socially. Villagers avoided your touch. Employers refused your labour. Families sometimes abandoned you out of shame. You were alive, but already a ghost. Imagine dragging yourself along a dirt path with your arms, dust in your mouth, children whispering behind their hands. The punishment did not end in the court. It followed you to every doorstep, every glance, every breath until death. Records speak of judges specifying punishments in detail. One might decree the left hand severed for theft, both feet removed for escaping exile. Precision was part of the cruelty, an official measuring not just guilt but the number of limbs a man was allowed to keep. Sentences were written like recipes. 1 hand for this crime, 2 feet for that. Bureaucracy turned butchery into paperwork, and it wasn't always reserved for the guilty. Torture during investigations was routine, confessions often extracted under duress. A man might lose his hands not because he stole, but because he couldn't endure the pain of questioning and admitted to theft he never committed. Truth mattered less than compliance. In such a system, the body became both evidence and punishment, scarred into agreement with the court. The instruments themselves were crude but effective. Sharp blades, heated irons, ropes to hold thrashing limbs. Executioners were skilled in speed, for drawn-out procedures risked killing the criminal too quickly. The goal wasn't mercy, but survival, at least long enough to let the lesson be visible. Pain was not a byproduct, but the point. You might say ancient justice had its own brand of marketing. Keep the punishment walking, and the people will remember. There's a grim humour in imagining the conversations that followed. A man missing both hands might be pointed out in a crowd. See him? He stole from the granary a child tugging at his mother's sleeve. Why does that man crawl? The mother's reply, because he defied the law. Living billboards, human caution signs, trailing the empire's warnings wherever they went. Forget posters on walls. The message walked, or rather stumbled through the village square. The Han Dynasty officially abolished some forms of these punishments, replacing them with whipping or exile, yet the memory lingered. In practice, mutilation never truly disappeared. Remote provinces continued it, judges quietly upheld it, and the scars of the system remained visible across centuries. The ghost of the 5 punishments haunted every courthouse, even when not applied. The mere threat was often enough to cow witnesses into obedience. And it wasn't just men. Women too could face mutilation, though often branding or facial scarring was chosen instead. Still, some records show women deprived of hands or feet, crawling through alleys with bound stumps, mocked for crimes they may not even have committed. Their fate was doubly cruel, for marriage, survival and reputation all collapsed at once. No husband would take them, no family would claim them. They became outcasts twice over, by law and by society. Stranger still, some mutilated criminals lived for years. They developed new ways to survive, crafting tools to eat, begging with songs, dragging themselves through markets. Over time, their suffering became normalized, part of the urban scenery. Imagine walking past someone with no feet and barely looking twice because you've seen it so many times before. That was the true power of the punishment. Not just shocking once, but embedding itself into the ordinary, turning horror into background noise. One story tells of a man punished with amputation, who nevertheless became a respected storyteller. He travelled on a cart pulled by friends, reciting tales in markets, his missing limbs visible as he gestured with stumps. Crowds gathered, children laughed, coins clinked into bowls. He transformed his shame into spectacle, survival through words. Yet even in this, he was trapped by his sentence, defined forever by what was missing. For rulers, the 5 punishments were efficient. They required no prisons, no long-term costs. A mutilated man policed himself, too broken to rebel, too shamed to resist. The empire could move on without feeding or guarding him. The cruelty was the cost-saving measure of its day. Brutality doubled as budget policy. When you step back, it reveals a chilling truth about human systems. Sometimes the most shocking practices are not random cruelty but deliberate efficiency. A society that invented paper and compasses also invented ways to erase its undesirables with chilling precision. It is hard not to imagine the contradictions. Scholars writing poetry about harmony while outside, a man with no feet dragged himself through the dust, a living punctuation mark to the empire's laws. And as with so many customs, it became normalized. People grew up seeing it, speaking of it in whispers but not outrage. To them, it was the way of the world. The emperor reigned, officials judged, and bodies bore the cost. Just as bound feet became beauty, so mutilation became justice. The strangeness is not just in the act, but in its acceptance. So picture it again. The magistrate's hall, the crowd pressing forward, the executioner raising a blade, a cry, a thud, a silence broken only by the shuffle of a body learning to move without parts of itself. The lesson was learned not in words but in scars, and across the empire every scar told the same story. Disobedience carved into flesh, a warning carried not on scrolls but on skin. The clang of the magistrate's blade fades, but the fear it leaves behind stretches into entire bloodlines. In ancient China, punishment did not always stop with the guilty. Sometimes it rolled like a thundercloud across generations, sweeping parents, children, cousins, and even distant relatives into its storm. It was called the Zhu Zhu, or the execution of 9 generations. Treason, rebellion, even careless criticism of the throne could trigger it. And when it did, the result was annihilation, not of a single life, but of an entire family tree. Imagine the knock at midnight. Soldiers surround the compound, torches blazing against the dark. The accused man, perhaps a minister or general, is dragged from his bed. His wife clutches the children, thinking only of his fate, but then neighbours are seized, cousins arrested, grandparents bound. The terror dawns slowly. This isn't just one man's punishment, it's the obliteration of his entire bloodline, as if history itself were being erased in flesh. The law specified 9 groups: the criminal himself, his parents, his children and grandchildren, his siblings, his uncles, his cousins, and so on. In some cases, even people sharing his surname but with no close relation could be swept up. Think of it as guilt by association, except the association is a family tree you never chose. One man's rebellion could condemn hundreds. You might never have spoken to your uncle, yet his misstep could cost your life. Thanksgiving dinners are awkward enough without the added risk of mass execution. The punishment was as much political theatre as it was law. Executions of 9 generations were public, dramatic, meant to strike fear into the hearts of anyone considering defiance. Picture rows of prisoners lined up in the Capitol, guards reading their names aloud, crowds murmuring as entire clans bowed their heads. Fathers beside sons, mothers beside daughters, all chained together in the knowledge that one person's choice sealed everyone's fate. It was history's most brutal version of a family reunion. For men, death was usually swift, though not always merciful. Beheadings, strangulation, or more elaborate methods like slow slicing if the crime was considered especially heinous. Women were spared execution in the technical sense, but not in reality. Many were enslaved, forced into the palace as servants, or sold into brothels. Some became concubines for soldiers as rewards. Children were stripped of their names, their books, their futures. Surviving girls were branded as tainted, unfit for marriage, while boys were sent into servitude. It wasn't just death. It was obliteration of identity, a wiping clean of family lines. The cruelty lay not only in the executions, but in the lingering effects. Imagine a child raised knowing his grandfather's words had doomed the family. His name erased, his rights stripped, his entire existence a punishment he did not earn. Even if he survived, he lived as a ghost in society, a reminder of rebellion unfit for citizenship. The punishment of 9 generations was not simply an ending. It was a curse that outlasted lifetimes. Why such harshness? To emperors, it was prevention. Treason wasn't just a crime, it was contagion. If rebellion could spread through loyalty to kin, then the surest way to stop it was to cut the kinship itself. Destroy the family, and you destroy the roots of defiance. It was fear weaponized as law, ensuring that no one would dare risk plotting when their mistake could erase every cousin, niece, or grandson. In a society built on filial piety, nothing was more terrifying than endangering your ancestors' memory and your descendants' lives. The logic was clear but twisted. In a land where family was everything, where honouring parents and raising sons were sacred duties, the law turned that devotion into a trap. The greater your love for your family, the less likely you were to rebel. Every father, every mother, carried the burden of silence, afraid that their words could condemn generations unborn. It was obedience enforced not by loyalty but by terror. Examples litter history. Ministers who criticised emperors found their clans slaughtered. Generals accused of ambition saw their households erased overnight. During purges, thousands perished in cascades of guilt. Even poets and scholars could trigger it if their writings hinted at dissent. Imagine penning a line about injustice, only to realise too late that your verse had cost your grandson his life. Today, we fear bad reviews. In ancient China, a poorly chosen metaphor could doom a dynasty of your own bloodline. And yet, some dared anyway. Rebellion still rose, treason still simmered, because the human spirit strains against silence. Families went to their deaths in grim acceptance, some cursing the emperor with their final breath, others begging forgiveness not for themselves, but for the innocents beside them. In execution grounds, entire households knelt together, children clinging to parents, elders leaning on canes, waiting for the sword to fall. It is one of the most chilling images in history, loyalty to blood meeting the blade of the state. For onlookers, the message was unmistakable. Watch one family erased, and you think twice before whispering dissent. The spectacle itself became part of governance. Fear replaced persuasion, and silence became survival. You didn't just guard your tongue for your own sake, you guarded it for every relative within 9 branches of your family tree. Imagine the pressure at family dinners, everyone warning each other, don't even joke about the emperor. Laughter could be lethal, there's a dark irony here. While emperors relied on Confucian ideals of filial piety to justify their rule, they twisted the same ideals into weapons. Confucius preached honour for parents, duty to family, loyalty across generations. The execution of 9 generations inverted that teaching. Instead of protecting families, it destroyed them. Instead of continuity, it severed bloodlines. It was Confucian morality turned inside out. Proof that even noble philosophy can be twisted into cruelty by absolute power. The punishment's reach extended even into death. Families executed in this way often had their graves desecrated, their ancestral tablets burned, their names struck from records. It wasn't enough to kill the living. Memory itself had to be destroyed. To ancient Chinese, who believed ancestors' spirits lingered and required offerings, this was the ultimate punishment. Extinction not just in body but in remembrance. Oblivion was the final verdict, and yet, like so many shocking customs, it became normalized. For centuries the phrase 9 generations hung like a sword over officials' heads. Ministers tempered their advice, scholars couched their criticisms in riddles, generals weighed loyalty against risk. The empire functioned not just on laws and taxes, but on the quiet terror that one wrong move could condemn your cousins in another province. Think of how it shaped the psychology of an entire people. Families grew cautious, teaching children silence from an early age. Proverbs warned against careless speech. Trust narrowed. Even kin could become dangerous if their actions threatened the whole. In a way, the punishment of 9 generations enforced conformity so deeply that it became part of the cultural fabric. When obedience is survival, disobedience dies not just with you, but with everyone who shares your blood. The horror of it is easy to overlook now, reduced to lines in history books. But pause for a moment and imagine yourself in that courtyard, chains around your wrists, your grandmother weeping beside you, your son clutching your sleeve. You didn't commit treason, you didn't even speak, but you carry the name of someone who did, and so the sword falls for you too. Among all the strange, brutal and absurd customs of ancient China, few shock as much as this. Not because of its gore, though there was plenty, but because of its scale. It was not the mutilation of one body, but the erasure of entire family trees. In the shadow of that law, silence became the only safe language, and the echo of fear lingered for centuries. The echoes of execution fade into a quieter cruelty, one that did not slice flesh or spill blood, but instead wrapped its victims in silence. Imagine a palace chamber where not a whisper stirs, where attendants move like ghosts, and the only sound is the soft sweep of silk slippers across polished tiles. Here, punishment took an unusual form. Speech itself was forbidden. This was not voluntary meditation or monastic vow. It was a sentence, a command from above. In certain corners of ancient China, enforced silence became as binding as chains, a way to control bodies by erasing voices. The origins of this practice lay in the obsession with purity within the emperor's forbidden precincts, spaces considered so sacred that even sound was viewed as contamination. Eunuchs working in these inner zones sometimes lived entire lives without permission to speak. They communicated with gestures, written notes, or carefully trained facial expressions. Imagine years passing without the freedom to say a single word, your voice fading until you barely remember how it once sounded. A man could stand beside the emperor every day and yet be voiceless, his loyalty measured by how well he swallowed his own tongue. Concubines, too, could fall under silence as punishment. A woman suspected of jealousy, disobedience, or even bad luck might be sentenced to muteness. It wasn't enough to confine her. She had to be stripped of speech itself. She might wear a wooden sign around her neck carved with characters reading, "No right to speak." This was more than humiliation. It was a public declaration that her words no longer counted as human currency. Imagine walking through palace gardens, servants passing you, eyes sliding away because your voice had been revoked by decree. Breaking silence was dangerous. Records describe offenders beaten with bamboo rods, demoted to the lowest ranks, or in severe cases executed for daring to speak when forbidden. It seems absurd to us now, death over syllables, but in a society where language was tightly bound to order, controlling speech meant controlling thought. Silence wasn't just punishment, it was obedience made visible. Picture the daily life of someone under this sentence. Dawn breaks, servants bustle, concubines chat, officials hurry past. You stand in the corner, hands folded, lips sealed. Someone asks a question, but you cannot reply. You want to laugh at a joke, but laughter counts as speech. Even sighs are dangerous, for sighs reveal thoughts. Over time, your silence becomes heavier than iron. Your mind grows restless, words circling inside with nowhere to go. like birds trapped in a cage. There's an almost theatrical irony here. In a palace where scribes recorded the emperor's every intimate act, others were forbidden from uttering a single word. Noise and silence coexisted like yin and yang, carefully distributed to reinforce hierarchy. The emperor's voice shook the realm. A eunuch's silence confirmed it. One sound amplified by heaven, the other muted into nothingness. The psychological toll was immense. To be silenced is to be erased gradually, day by day. Some sentenced to lifelong silence were said to develop vacant stares, moving mechanically through tasks, their inner selves buried under layers of repression. Others resisted in subtle ways, creating elaborate gestures or tapping rhythms with their fingers to convey messages. Small rebellions of noise, tiny leaks of humanity in an ocean of quiet. In one story, a eunuch punished with silence for mishandling documents developed a language of folded cloths. He would crease his sleeves in certain ways to signal messages to trusted allies. Another silent servant reportedly hummed tunelessly under his breath, low enough to avoid detection but enough to remind himself he still possessed a voice. These stories suggest that silence, though imposed, was never complete. The human urge to communicate always found cracks in the wall. To the onlookers, though, silence was spectacle. A concubine walking with her no right to speak sign became both warning and entertainment. Other women mocked her behind fans, eunuchs smirked as they passed. Her humiliation was a lesson for them all. Speak wrongly, and you too will vanish into voicelessness. Silence as punishment worked because it turned individuals into living examples, their quiet more terrifying than screams. And yet, it wasn't only about fear. Some emperors genuinely believed silence preserved sanctity. In Taoist thought, quietude connected with purity, with harmony between heaven and man. To strip servants of speech was to maintain cosmic balance, preventing mortal chatter from polluting sacred space. What looks to us like cruelty sometimes looked to them like devotion. The palace wasn't merely political, it was spiritual theatre, where even silence became ritual. For the victims, however, it was rarely mystical. It was exile within walls. To be silenced meant exclusion from human community, for language was the glue of relationships. Without it, friendships withered, affection faltered. Imagine being unable to comfort a crying child, unable to thank a friend, unable to defend yourself against lies. Every interaction became one-sided, a stage where you played the role of furniture. Over time, the practice spread beyond the palace. Some courts sentenced criminals to enforce silence instead of mutilation. A thief might be gagged in public for months, forbidden to speak under threat of beating. In some monasteries, silence was imposed as penance, though there it took on a more religious flavour. Still, the roots were the same. Control the voice, and you control the person. The cruelty lay in its invisibility. Unlike mutilation, silence left no scars, no missing limbs. From a distance, the punished looked whole, but their hollowness was revealed the moment you tried to speak with them and were met only with lowered eyes. It was suffering hidden in plain sight, cruelty disguised as peace. And perhaps that is why it shocks us now. We expect punishment to be loud, violent, dramatic. But here, it was the absence of sound that terrified. Imagine a banquet where laughter filled the hall, except for one woman seated stiffly in the corner, smiling faintly but forbidden to utter a word. The silence around her is louder than the music, more piercing than drums. It gnaws at the edges of the room until everyone feels its weight. This was the genius of the sentence. It punished the victim while unsettling the witnesses. Silence is contagious. It spreads, reminding others of the emperor's power, making every conversation feel fragile. Words became precious, measured, weighed. Better to say nothing than to risk losing speech forever. Even after death, silence lingered. Those who died under the punishment were sometimes buried without epitaphs, their tombstones left blank as if their muteness had followed them into eternity. Families mourned quietly, reluctant to speak of them, afraid the curse of silence might extend by association. Thus the punishment achieved what all tyrannical laws dream of. It extended beyond life, shaping memory itself. So tonight, picture the palace halls once more. Lanterns flicker, silk rustles, whispers float on the air. And there, in the corner, stands a eunuch with lips pressed tight. A wooden placard around his neck declaring his voicelessness. He watches, listens, obeys. His silence is not choice, not devotion, but decree. You strain to imagine the sound of his voice, but you never will. It has been erased, swallowed by the empire's hunger for control. In a world where feet were bound, families erased, and bodies mutilated, perhaps the most chilling custom was this, a punishment that left the body intact but hollowed out the soul, reducing a human being to a mute presence in the emperor's theatre. Silence itself became law, and the echo of that silence still startles across history's stage. Night has fallen again, and in the emperor's chambers the glow of candles paints shadows across scrolls filled with diagrams of stars, mountains, and formulas written in black ink. Alchemists shuffle in with bundles of herbs, flasks of strange powders, and a look of deep conviction, or perhaps deep opportunism. They promise what no soldier, no minister, no general can deliver: immortality. And emperors, terrified of time's march, believed them. Thus began one of the strangest and most tragic customs of ancient China, the pursuit of eternal life through elixirs that were more poison than cure. The most infamous case is Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. A man who built the Great Wall and commissioned the Terracotta Army. He feared only one enemy he could not conquer: death. Determined to cheat it, he surrounded himself with alchemists who mixed pills of mercury, cinnabar, gold dust, and jade powder. Each shimmering concoction was presented with reverence, as though the more it glittered, the more it promised eternity. And so, the emperor swallowed poison daily, convinced it was nectar. Instead of endless youth, he found delirium, seizures, and eventually death on a distant journey. His body carried back to the capital, in a cart filled with rotting fish to mask the stench, a tragic end disguised under the perfume of immortality. But he was far from alone. Emperor after emperor followed the same path, chasing legends of deathless sages who supposedly lived in the mountains. Taoist texts spoke of metals as incorruptible, resistant to decay, and therefore carriers of eternal life. If gold never tarnished, why not eat it? If mercury glistened endlessly, why not drink it? It sounds absurd to us now, but in their minds it was science wrapped in mysticism. Swallowing glitter was seen as swallowing eternity. Imagine modern vitamin commercials promising live forever, with a side effect list that includes may cause foaming at the mouth. The recipes varied, but the results rarely did. Mercury in particular was a favourite. Its shimmering liquid form seemed magical, alive even, flowing like a captured spirit. But inside the body it ravaged organs, fried nerves, and blackened gums. Symptoms were rebranded as progress. Hair loss, proof the body was shedding mortality. Tremors, evidence of divine energy coursing through veins. Vomiting blood, a cleansing of earthly corruption. Death. Well, clearly the dosage wasn't quite right. The circular logic was convenient for the alchemists, disastrous for the emperors. Some rulers consumed so much mercury that their bodies, when exhumed, showed traces centuries later. Archaeologists testing soil around imperial tombs sometimes find mercury levels hundreds of times higher than normal, silent testimony to a fatal obsession. The very earth remembers their folly. Standing near such a tomb today is like standing beside a glowing warning label written by history itself. And yet, belief persisted. Why? Because to abandon it was to admit weakness. Emperors styled themselves as sons of heaven, intermediaries between mortal and divine. To accept mortality was to accept that they were mere men, subject to the same decay as peasants who ate from pig toilets. That thought was intolerable. Better to drink poison and call it medicine than to face the inevitable. Fear of death turned into policy, into ritual, into daily routines that killed slowly and inexorably. The consequences stretched beyond emperors. Alchemists gained immense power, their recipes protected like state secrets. Entire workshops were dedicated to grinding jade, melting cinnabar, distilling mercury. Servants carried bowls of glittering concoctions on silk cushions, as though delivering sacred relics. To refuse the emperor's demand was unthinkable, so physicians often went along prescribing ever more elaborate elixirs. Some likely knew the harm, but chose survival over honesty. After all, telling the emperor, "Actually, sire, you're drinking poison," was a career move shorter than the emperor's life expectancy. The irony is brutal. In their quest to live forever, emperors often shortened their lives dramatically. Some died in their 30s or 40s, twitching from mercury-induced tremors. Others went mad, issuing erratic decrees, convinced they were ascending to heaven even as their bodies failed. Subjects suffered too, for a poisoned emperor was rarely a wise emperor. Policies wavered, paranoia spread, and stability faltered. Immortality fever didn't just kill rulers, it destabilized dynasties. Legends fueled the obsession. Tales told of islands of immortals, places where sages drank dew and lived for centuries. Expeditions were launched to find them, fleets sent across seas in search of paradise. Of course, they found nothing but waves, but failure only strengthened belief. Clearly the immortals were hiding, or the rituals had not been performed correctly. Hope is the cruelest intoxicant. It survives every disappointment. And so, emperors kept drinking, kept searching, kept dying. For common people, the practice looked both absurd and terrifying. Villagers whispered that their emperor glowed with strange light, his skin flushed or paled from potions. Rumours spread of rulers collapsing mid-ceremony, frothing at the mouth while priests insisted it was a sign of ascension. Meanwhile, peasants buried their dead quietly, accepting mortality with a pragmatism their rulers lacked. The contrast is stark. The poorest farmer understood death better than the mightiest emperor. Yet the allure of alchemy reached beyond rulers. Wealthy nobles purchased elixirs for themselves, convinced they could buy not only silk and land but eternity. Markets in some cities sold longevity powders to anyone rich enough, peddled by men who promised connections to Taoist sages. The line between medicine and scam blurred. Some mixtures contained herbs that at least had mild effects, others were pure poison. Deaths were frequent, but belief was stronger than evidence. After all, the dead couldn't file complaints. It's tempting to laugh now. Imagine influencers today promoting liquid mercury detox on social media. The absurdity is clear in hindsight, but in its time, it was wrapped in philosophy, science, and faith. The desire to live forever made rational thought optional, and in truth, are we so different? We swallow supplements, chase miracle diets, buy creams promising youth. The ingredients have changed, but the desperation is the same. The line between wellness and wishful thinking remains thin. The tragic beauty of it lies in the symbolism. Gold, untarnished and eternal, seemed to embody immortality. Mercury, fluid and shimmering, seemed alive. To drink them was to participate in the cosmos, to align one's body with incorruptible elements. In poetry, the act sounded divine. In practice, it was suicide by sparkle. The clash between metaphor and reality was deadly, yet profoundly human. So picture the emperor at his table, jade cup in hand, attendants bowing low as he swallows another shimmering draught. His lips stain with cinnabar. His breath smells metallic. His hands tremble slightly as scribes record the ritual. He believes he is one sip closer to eternity. In truth, he is one sip closer to his grave. Outside, peasants light lanterns, children chase fireflies. Life continues in its fragile mortal rhythm. The emperor, for all his power, is trapped in a delusion, enslaved not by enemies but by his own refusal to accept time. In the end, immortality eluded them all. The emperors died, the dynasties fell, the alchemists vanished into obscurity. What remains are tombs, scrolls, and traces of mercury in the soil, a chemical fingerprint of desperation. Their quest is shocking not only for its folly but for its persistence. Century after century, rulers repeated the same mistake, blinded by fear, deaf to reason, convinced that death was an insult they could outwit. Perhaps that is the final lesson. Even the most powerful cannot bargain with time. No army, no wall, no elixir can shield against the inevitable. And yet, in their failure, they left behind stories that glitter as strangely as the mercury they swallowed. Tales of emperors shimmering with poison, chasing eternity through cups of liquid death. The candle smoke curls upward, leaving faint streaks on the beams of a village home, where a family huddles around a dim fire. There is little meat, less money, and even less soap. Clothes are worn for weeks, baths are rare, and the body becomes a little ecosystem of its own. In this world, lice are not intruders, they are house guests. And in some corners of ancient China, they were not only tolerated but occasionally eaten. Yes, lice, the crawling, biting, blood-drinking parasites that today send school nurses into emergency meetings. In some villages, they became a strange, shocking part of daily life. Imagine scratching at your scalp after days in the fields, nails finding a tiny lump. You pinch, squeeze, and hear the faint pop as the insect bursts. Many people flicked them into the fire, but others placed them between their teeth and bit down. Not for protein, though technically there's a little, but for superstition. Ethnographic records describe a belief that returning the parasite to your own body, through eating, closed the cycle and prevented infestations from spreading further. A crude logic. If it fed on you, it belonged to you, and sending it back inside would discourage it from seeking fresh ground. Modern science may scoff, but for a peasant family in a world without medicine, it almost sounded reasonable. Children, of course, turned it into games. Accounts mention boys lining lice on fingernails and flicking them at each other like living pebbles. Girls sometimes compared who had the largest catch, squashing them on walls with tiny crimson smears. Picture a schoolyard competition, except the playground equipment is your scalp and the scoreboard is your sleeve. To us, it's grotesque. To them, it was childhood entertainment, born from necessity and boredom. The ubiquity of lice was staggering. Cramped, homes, straw mats, shared bedding. Perfect conditions for infestations. Washing clothes in winter was nearly impossible, and soap was rare and precious. A family might boil their garments once a season if lucky. More often, they wore them until fabric grew stiff with sweat and dirt. In that environment, lice thrived. It was not a matter of cleanliness so much as survival in tight quarters. Everyone had them, from farmers to servants, sometimes even lower-ranking officials. The difference was only in how people chose to deal with them. Some regions treated lice as a minor nuisance, to be picked and squashed with the same resignation as brushing flies away. Others, especially in poorer mountain villages, incorporated them into odd folk practices. Eating lice wasn't widespread across all China, but where it occurred, it was normalized enough that outsiders recorded it with shock. One traveller noted that peasants laughed at his disgust, saying, "It is our own blood returning." That phrase captures the strange blend of practicality and superstition that shaped so many customs. Lice even found their way into folk medicine. Certain healers recommended grinding them into paste for skin conditions or mixing them with vinegar to treat fevers. The logic followed the ancient principle of like cures like. If lice caused itching, perhaps they could also cure it. The science, needless to say, was non-existent, but belief was often stronger than evidence. And when other remedies were out of reach, people clung to whatever hope they could grasp. Yes, even if it crawled between their fingers. Consider the irony. Emperors drank mercury in palaces gilded with jade, while peasants popped lice in mud brick homes. Both sought survival through shocking means. One glittered with fatal ambition, the other scratched in quiet desperation. Different worlds, same fear of sickness and death, same willingness to do whatever seemed necessary. When resources are scarce, disgust becomes a luxury. If swallowing a parasite might bring relief, why not try? There was even a strange intimacy in lice picking. Families sat together in evenings, mothers combing through children's hair, spouses checking each other's collars, siblings laughing as they found and crushed tiny invaders. In a world with little privacy, this grooming became both necessity and bonding ritual. One woman described it in a folk tale as sharing our burdens one bite at a time. Disgusting, yes, but also oddly tender. The boundary between love and survival blurred, woven together by fingernails and scratching. Of course, lice carried disease. Epidemics spread in part through these pests, especially in crowded conditions. Yet awareness of this connection was hazy. People noticed patterns. More lice meant more fevers, but explanations range from angry ancestors to unlucky stars. Without microscopes, the true culprits remained invisible, and so customs persisted. It is haunting to think of families popping lice for health while unknowingly spreading sickness with every squeeze. And yet some practices showed a crude kind of effectiveness. Picking lice nightly reduced infestations, even if eating them did nothing. Boiling clothes occasionally worked, and herbal washes sometimes repelled pests. In their clumsy way, these customs were attempts at hygiene. The shock lies not only in the acts themselves, but in their earnestness. People truly believed they were protecting their families, even as they horrify us centuries later. One anecdote tells of a scholar travelling through rural provinces, appalled to see peasants crunching lice between their teeth. When he recoiled, villagers mocked him. "You eat animals from other lands, and you are disgusted by what comes from your own blood?" Their sarcasm cuts deep, exposing the relativity of disgust. To them, chickens, ducks, or pigs were no less strange than parasites that lived off their own bodies. In a world of hunger, all boundaries blurred. It wasn't always so grim. Folk songs joked about lice as symbols of stubbornness. The louse clings to cloth like a lover who won't let go. Storytellers spun tales of lice as mischievous spirits, hiding in hair, whispering bad dreams, sneaking into beds. Humour softened disgust, making the unavoidable more bearable. Laughter, after all, is sometimes the only defence against the absurdities of survival. So picture it. A winter evening, wind rattling the shutters, a family huddled close. A mother parts her daughter's hair, plucks a louse, and with practised ease crushes it on the hearth. The daughter giggles, the father scratches at his own collar, the grandmother hums a lullaby. It is repulsive to us, but for them it was rhythm, routine, life. The shocking becomes ordinary when lived daily. Among all the strange customs of ancient China, this one stands out not for its grandeur but for its intimacy. It wasn't decreed by emperors or codified in law. It grew in kitchens and courtyards, whispered in superstition, shared in laughter and groans. It reminds us that shock is relative, that what horrifies one culture may comfort another, that even lice, tiny, crawling, despised, can become woven into the fabric of daily survival. And as you imagine that dim hut, the scratching, the popping, the laughter, remember this: history is not only emperors in gilded halls or armies on battlefields, it is also the small, unsettling habits of ordinary people trying to make sense of a hard world. Sometimes survival looks like fireworks and philosophy. Sometimes it looks like a louse between your fingers. The winter wind rattles the shutters of a mountain village house, where incense burns slowly before an ancestral altar. A young man lies in a coffin, his face pale and his body wrapped in white cloth. His parents weep, not only for his death, but for his loneliness in the afterlife. To them, it is unthinkable that he should enter the spirit world unmarried, without a wife to share eternity. And so, the family prepares a ritual that to modern minds feels ghostly and absurd, a marriage for the dead. This was no metaphor. In ancient China, it was a practice called ghost marriage, where the deceased were wed to the deceased, or sometimes to the living, to ensure companionship beyond the grave. Imagine the scene. The family consults a matchmaker, not for a bride who can walk through the door, but for one lying in another coffin. Negotiations unfold between grieving households. If a young woman has died recently, her family may agree to unite her spirit with the dead man. Bride prices exchanged, dowries prepared, paper effigies crafted. The marriage is carried out with solemn ritual, red cloth draped, offerings of food and wine placed beside the coffins, prayers whispered to bind the souls together. Two lives cut short are joined in death, as though eternity itself were incomplete without ceremony. And if no female corpse is available, substitutes were made: wax dolls, wooden effigies, or plaques inscribed with names stood in as brides. They were placed beside the dead man in his grave, symbolising companionship. The logic was haunting but clear. Better a spirit wife carved from wood than no wife at all. Imagine being honoured at your wedding banquet and discovering your partner is a pine board with red ribbons. It sounds absurd, yet to families it was comfort. Proof their son would not wander alone in the afterlife. Sometimes the arrangement went further still. A living woman might be married to a dead man, particularly if his family was wealthy. Her parents received a bride price, but she herself was bound to widowhood forever. She moved into her husband's family home, served his parents, and lived as the wife of a ghost. She could not remarry, could not bear children with another man, for her life was pledged to someone in a grave. Imagine cooking dinner every evening while your in-laws remind you politely to keep faith with your deceased husband. It was both honour and prison, a fate shaped by poverty and tradition. Why such devotion to ghostly unions? At its core lay fear of restless spirits. A young man who died unmarried might become a hungry ghost, wandering, envious of the living, bringing misfortune to his family. Marriage was protection, sealing his spirit into the social fabric even beyond death. It gave structure to grief and safety to the living. In a culture where family continuity was sacred, even the dead could not be left single. Archaeological evidence confirms these practices. Graves have been found with two coffins side by side, or with male skeletons accompanied by female figurines. Inscriptions speak of marriages carried out posthumously, sometimes decades after one partner's death, when another suitable spirit became available. The dead waited patiently, it seemed, for matchmaking to catch up. Picture entire genealogies arranged not only among the living but across cemeteries, as if family trees extended roots into the underworld. The rituals themselves mirrored weddings of the living. Red cloths draped coffins, firecrackers were set off towards spirits, offerings of roasted pig and wine were made. Guests attended, eating, drinking, gossiping as though it were a joyous occasion. Only the bride and groom lay silent, their presence symbolized by effigies or portraits. In this paradoxical celebration, grief and festivity intertwined. Laughter and tears mingled, for weddings meant fortune, even when the couple was already gone. The eerie twist is how often these marriages intersected with commerce. Matchmakers specialized in pairing the dead, charging families for their services. Coffin makers, doll carvers, and paper effigy sellers profited from grief. Some regions even saw a black market for female corpses, stolen from graves to serve as brides for dead men. Families desperate to fulfill obligations sometimes resorted to theft, a crime that horrified authorities but persisted nonetheless. The combination of desperation, superstition, and commerce turned cemeteries into hunting grounds for marriageable corpses. And yet, not all ghost marriages were tragic. Some were acts of love. Records tell of betrothed couples where one died before marriage. The surviving partner sometimes insisted on marrying the deceased anyway, to honour their bond. A young woman might don wedding clothes, kneel before the coffin of her fiancé, and pledge herself to him in eternity. She became his widow instantly, refusing other suitors, living in fidelity to someone beyond the veil. It is both heartbreaking and strangely beautiful, a love that defied the finality of death. For the living women bound into ghost marriages, life was complicated. Some accepted their roles, caring for in-laws as dutiful daughters-in-law, wearing widows' garments, performing rites. Others resisted quietly, sneaking relationships or longing for freedom they could never claim. Society judged them harshly, for loyalty to a dead husband was considered virtue. To break it was scandal, and so many endured silent, invisible lives, their youth sacrificed to an empty bed. The practice persisted for centuries, into the 19th and even 20th century in rural regions. Even today, ghost marriages occasionally surface in parts of China, though now often as clandestine, sensational news stories. The motivations remain the same: fear of loneliness in the afterlife, desire for social harmony, and the deep-rooted belief that marriage completes a life, even if that life has already ended. It is shocking to modern minds, and yet it reveals something profoundly human. Beneath the strangeness lies a longing we all share, the refusal to accept that death severs love and duty. Ghost marriages gave shape to grief, turning absence into ritual, loneliness into companionship, despair into structure. In their world, it made sense. To them, leaving a son or daughter unmarried even in death was unthinkable. To us, it is grotesque. The difference is not in the heart, but in the customs we build around it. So imagine yourself in that dim mountain house again. The family gathers, incense burns, paper dolls smile with painted faces. Outside, villagers murmur about the oddity, yet they come to eat, to drink, to bear witness. The bride and groom do not rise, do not smile, do not thank the guests. Yet the families sigh in relief. Their children will not be alone in the afterlife. The ritual is complete, the bond sealed. In the silence of the grave, two spirits are joined forever. Among all the shocking practices of ancient China, ghost marriage carries a special chill. Not because it was cruel, but because it was tender in a way twisted by fear. It was love rewritten by death, obligation continued beyond breath, humanity clinging to connection where none could truly remain. And perhaps in its strangeness, it speaks to us still, that even in death, people long to be seen, remembered, and never left alone. The halls of the palace fade, and we step now into the far-off valleys of remote provinces, where hospitality meant more than offering a guest rice and a place to sleep. In some mountain villages of ancient China, generosity could extend to the most shocking level, giving a guest the company of your wife for the night. Imagine travelling, weary from the road, and being welcomed not just with food, but with the words, "Here, share what I value most." This was not a joke or insult. It was custom, a ritual of respect, a tradition older than most dynasties. In these places, a host's reputation depended on how completely he cared for his guest. Offering shelter, a fire, or even the last scraps of meat was expected. But to offer his wife, or in some cases his daughter, sister, or servant, was the ultimate sign of honour. Refusing could be taken as an insult, an accusation that the host's generosity was not good enough. Acceptance, however awkward, meant respect had been given and received. Turning down the offer could sour relations, sometimes dangerously. Picture yourself standing in a doorway, stammering excuses, while your host frowns and mutters about disrespect. Suddenly, saying no thank you becomes a diplomatic crisis. Why such a practice? Scholars suggest several reasons. In isolated communities where outsiders were rare, hosting a guest became a sacred duty. Sharing food showed material generosity, but sharing one's wife demonstrated trust and openness. It was also tied to ideas of fertility and prosperity. Allowing a guest to sleep with one's wife was thought to bring good fortune, as though the union shared blessings with the household. Hospitality wasn't just survival, it was a spiritual contract. Women's voices in this custom are harder to find. Records written by male officials or travellers rarely mention whether wives consented or resisted. Some describe women complying silently, treating it as an extension of duty to family and household. Others hint at quiet resentment, masked by ritual politeness. The truth probably varied. In some cases, women may have felt honoured to play their role in a guest's welcome. In others, they may have endured it as another burden of tradition, like carrying water or harvesting grain. In either case, personal desire mattered little. Custom outweighed it. Not all guests were equal. The more important the visitor, the greater the honour. A wealthy merchant, a government inspector, or a travelling scholar might receive such an offer, while a ragged beggar was more likely given only food and straw. In some tales, entire households debated who should be offered, wife, daughter, or servant, based on the guest's perceived rank. Picture a family meeting around a fire, solemnly deciding who will represent their hospitality. To them it was practical. To us it borders on the surreal. Travellers from outside often recoiled. Chinese officials posted to remote provinces sometimes wrote horrified reports of these customs, calling them barbaric, immoral, or uncivilized. Yet for the villagers themselves, it was not strange. It was their way of weaving outsiders into their world, of binding strangers to their community. Refusing meant rejecting their values, accepting meant honouring them. Shock is often a matter of perspective. Some anthropologists later compared this practice to similar customs elsewhere. Inuit offering wives to explorers, Polynesian tribes extending women as part of ritualized hospitality. It seems across cultures, generosity sometimes crossed into intimacy, as though sharing the body was the final proof of trust. Still, the Chinese variation carried its own unique blend of family duty, superstition, and survival. The practice had ripple effects. Gifts from guests left in gratitude became markers of honour. A wife who entertained a noble visitor elevated her family's status in the village. Her compliance became part of the household's prestige. The guest's departure often left behind tokens, silver coins, bolts of cloth, or even livestock. Thus, women's bodies were woven into economic exchange, a system of hospitality that blurred the lines between respect, commerce, and exploitation. Of course, rumours spread. A woman who bore a child months after a guest's visit might face whispers about whose blood ran in the baby's veins. Some families saw this as fortune, believing the guest's spirit enriched the child. Others saw scandal, leading to disputes and shame. Hospitality could bring blessings, but also complications that lasted lifetimes. There were even stories of guests refusing politely, only to find themselves accused of cowardice or ingratitude. A man who declined could be mocked, his masculinity questioned, his reputation damaged. Acceptance, no matter how awkward, was safer than refusal. The pressure was immense. Imagine sitting stiffly in a stranger's hut, convinced you are honouring custom while inwardly wishing desperately to disappear. Ancient etiquette could turn survival into surreal theatre. Over time, authorities tried to stamp out the practice. Confucian ideals of family virtue clashed sharply with it. Officials scolded villagers, issued bans and preached morality. But traditions in remote areas die hard. Generations passed the custom along, often hidden from outsiders, continuing in whispered corners long after emperors condemned it. In truth, the shock lies not only in the act itself but in its normalization. Imagine entire communities where offering one's wife was no more remarkable than offering tea, where women's roles in hospitality were as expected as tending fields, where the line between honour and humiliation blurred so completely that it vanished. And yet, like so many strange customs, it reveals something deeply human. Beneath it was the same impulse that drives all hospitality: to connect, to honour, to ensure safety in a dangerous world. For them, this was the ultimate proof of welcome. To us, it is shocking, even grotesque, but both perspectives spring from the same root: the fear of isolation, the hunger for belonging. So picture the mountain hut again. The guest sits nervously, a bowl of rice before him. The host smiles proudly, gesturing to his wife. Outside, wind rattles bamboo, dogs bark in the dark. Inside, silence stretches thick with expectation. In that silence, you glimpse the strangeness of human custom, the way survival, honour, and intimacy can twist into shapes both tender and terrifying. Among all the shocking practices of ancient China, this one perhaps unsettles most not because of its violence, but because of its intimacy. It asks us to imagine generosity pushed to its extreme, hospitality turned into obligation, and honour entwined with sacrifice. And it reminds us that what one world calls grotesque, another may call virtue. The sounds of the mountain village fade, and now the scene shifts to the polished halls of the Qing dynasty court, where fashion and status gleamed not only in robes of silk but on fingertips. Here, fingernails became symbols of nobility, sometimes extending 4 to 6 inches long, curled like talons, sheathed in golden guards. In a society where hard labour defined the masses, the ability to grow absurdly long nails was proof that you never lifted a hoe, chopped wood, or stirred rice with your own hands. It was shocking, impractical, and yet deeply admired. Imagine a court official strolling into an audience with nails so long he can't even unroll his own scroll. A servant must do it for him, while he holds his hands aloft like precious artifacts. To the emperor, this was not incompetence, it was elegance. The longer the nails, the higher the rank, the more obvious the declaration: I am too refined to touch the earth. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of designer watches or luxury cars, except harder to fit into a glove. For women, long nails became a delicate art. They grew multiple fingers long and protected them with ornate nail guards made of silver, jade, or enamelled gold, etched with dragons, phoenixes, and blossoms. These guards glittered in candlelight, turning every hand gesture into theatre. Imagine sipping tea with nails so long you need 3 servants just to lift the cup. To the court it wasn't inconvenience, it was proof of privilege. Helplessness became a kind of power. Of course, daily life became absurd. Eating with chopsticks was nearly impossible, so attendants cut food into tiny bites and fed it directly. Dressing required help. Scratching an itch? Out of the question. There's a comic image in the records of a high-ranking lady summoning a servant simply to rub her nose. In a world obsessed with appearances, functionality was sacrificed to symbolism. The nails didn't serve you, you served the nails. Breaking a nail was catastrophic. Officials reportedly hid their hands in long sleeves if a nail snapped, too ashamed to reveal a commoner's stub. It was like arriving at a gala in torn clothes, except worse. Your entire status collapsed into a fingertip. Some even delayed official appearances until nails regrew, or were disguised with false extensions. Yes, false nails. Long before modern salons, the Qing elite were already improvising acrylics, albeit made of gold. The symbolism carried weight beyond vanity. In Confucian thought, the body was a gift from parents, not to be harmed or altered lightly. Long nails, left uncut, could be interpreted as filial devotion, To let them grow was to honour your heritage. Combine that with class distinction, and you had a practice that seemed virtuous and prestigious, even as it left people utterly helpless. Imagine praising someone for their moral depth, while also tying their shoelaces for them. Travellers from abroad were bewildered. Jesuit missionaries described officials with nails so long they curved backward, carried in protective cases. Some Europeans mocked it as ridiculous, comparing the elite to birds of prey, yet others were impressed, seeing it as proof of luxury. After all, what greater sign of wealth than the ability to survive without ever using your hands? Idleness itself became currency. Not all long nails belonged to nobles. Some scholars and artists grew them as a mark of refinement, claiming their delicate fingers better suited the brush when unburdened by manual work. Poets wrote verses comparing nails to crescent moons, elegant arcs that reflected inner cultivation. Whether or not ink smudges were practical with 6-inch claws is another matter. Imagine trying to write poetry while your fingers resemble miniature scythes. That is dedication to aesthetics at the expense of ergonomics. And the nail guards themselves became art. Crafted by jewellers, encrusted with gemstones, they were given as gifts, treasured as heirlooms and displayed at festivals. A lady might wear a matching set of 4, each one gleaming with different designs. In portraits, these guards catch the light, signalling not only status but taste. They remain in museums today, relics of a world where fashion was measured in inches of keratin and ounces of gold. Yet beneath the glitter lies the strangeness. Servants had to live in constant readiness, managing the needs of nail-bound masters. Imagine the daily grind of holding cups, adjusting robes, carrying scrolls, all because your employer's fingers were glorified talons. For the elite, nails were freedom from labour. For servants, they were an endless source of extra chores. The price of one person's privilege was another's burden. There is even a subtle cruelty in it. By growing nails to grotesque lengths, nobles broadcast their distance from the labouring masses. Every inch of keratin said, "I do not toil. I am not like you." In a land where peasants bent over fields until their hands cracked, elites flaunted nails that had never touched soil. Beauty became insult, fashion became declaration, privilege grew quite literally from the tips of their fingers. And yet there's also humour. Imagine court banquets where guests shuffle food awkwardly, servants hovering like frantic waiters, while conversation continues as though nothing is amiss. It is dignity wrapped around inconvenience, elegance balanced on absurdity. There's a strange charm in picturing an emperor gesturing grandly, sleeves flowing, nails glinting, while an aide discreetly scratches his head. History, it turns out, is full of such contradictions. The practice slowly faded with the fall of dynasties and the rise of modernity. Revolutionary movements mocked long nails as symbols of decadence, calling for hands that worked rather than ornamented. Yet even today echoes remain. In certain operas, characters wear exaggerated nail guards as part of costume. In fashion circles, Empress-style nails sometimes reappear as exotic inspiration. The old glamour still flickers, transformed into performance rather than daily life. So picture the image once more. A nobleman with nails curling like ivory crescents, a lady with golden guards glittering in lamplight, servants bustling to support every motion. Their helplessness is their strength, their fragility their pride. It shocks us because it feels inverted. How can inability be proof of superiority? And yet, in their world, that was the point. Power meant freedom from work, and long nails were the proof etched not in titles or robes, but in living keratin. Among the many strange customs of ancient China, this one sparkles with irony. Unlike mutilation or ghost marriages, it carried no pain, no direct cruelty. But it embodied the same theme: status enforced through the body. Feet were bound, nails were grown, voices silenced, all to show belonging in a hierarchy that valued symbols over comfort. And so, even in something as small as a fingertip, history reveals its shocking truths. The glitter of gold nail guards fades, and now we step into a colder chamber, the imperial court, where silence gives way to the sound of wood striking flesh. Here, even speech was not free. For officials reporting to the emperor, words began with blows. Before a memorial could be read, Before criticism could be offered, the ritual of self-punishment came first. Imagine kneeling on the stone floors, your head bowed, striking yourself to prove humility. In ancient China, this was not madness, it was protocol. Reports describe officials entering the throne room carrying wooden sticks, not for defense, but for beating themselves. A simple announcement might begin with slaps to the face. More serious matters, especially if the news was unpleasant, demanded harder blows, sticks against the chest, against the back, even drawing blood before words left the lips. It was a performance of submission, a way to remind the emperor that his subjects were unworthy to speak before the Son of Heaven. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, pain became punctuation. Picture a line of ministers waiting their turn. One adjusts his robe nervously, one grips a stick, another rubs bruises still tender from yesterday. When his name is called, he kneels, bows, and strikes himself 1, 2, 3, before daring to speak. If the report concerns bad harvests, rebellion, or mistakes in policy, the blows must be harder. Sometimes officials arrived already battered, having beaten themselves at home to show they understood the gravity. Imagine a boardroom where every PowerPoint began with the presenter smacking himself in the face. That was court life under certain emperors. Why such a strange custom? It tied back to Confucian ideals of humility and hierarchy. Officials were supposed to see themselves as dust before the emperor, guilty merely of standing in his presence. To show contrition physically was to prove sincerity. Words alone might be dismissed as cleverness. Bruises were harder to fake. A swollen cheek said, "I speak at my own expense." Believe me, in effect, pain became proof of loyalty. But this ritual also acted as insurance. If an official had to deliver criticism, he might beat himself severely first, hoping to soften the emperor's anger. By suffering voluntarily, he showed that he expected punishment already, pleading for forgiveness through bruises. Some even timed their blows to coincide with especially harsh phrases, like underlining their words with blood. Your Majesty's policy fails the people. Whack. The army suffers hunger. Whack, whack. Each strike carried the rhythm of desperate honesty. Over time, the practice grew extreme. During the Ming dynasty, reports describe officials smashing their heads on stone floors until they bled. Some fainted. Mid-report, their bodies collapsing before they finished. Others left the chamber with split lips, torn robes, faces swollen grotesquely. To modernize, it looks like masochism. But to them, it was survival. Better to bleed a little than to lose your life entirely for offending the emperor. Pain was currency, traded for leniency, and the emperors, they varied. Some watched with satisfaction, nodding as bruised ministers spoke. Others grew impatient, cutting short the ritual with a flick of the hand. A few even mocked their officials, accusing them of melodrama. Yet none abolished the practice entirely. It reinforced the image of the emperor as divine, his subjects unworthy, his throne a stage where humility had to be performed physically. The more officials suffered, the higher the emperor's pedestal rose. There is dark humour here too. Imagine a scholar, frail and elderly, dragging himself into court, attempting to slap his own face hard enough to impress. The sound barely registers. He tries again, wincing, his hand trembling. The emperor stifles a laugh, courtiers snicker behind sleeves, until finally the old man collapses in exhaustion before uttering a single word. His report may never even be read, but the performance was complete. A tragic comedy played on marble floors. The ritual also left marks beyond bruises. Some officials wore scars for life, broken noses, misaligned jaws, chronic pain in shoulders and ribs. These injuries became silent badges of loyalty, reminders etched into the body. A man limping through the palace might not have fought in war, but he bore wounds from years of bowing and beating himself in the service of words. Pain became the uniform of governance. This practice also discouraged free speech. Knowing that every criticism required blows, officials often hesitated. Some softened reports, downplayed disasters, or avoided topics altogether to spare themselves. The ritual meant to prove honesty sometimes silenced it. Ironically, emperors who demanded self-punishment often blinded themselves to truth, surrounded by officials too bruised to speak plainly. Governance became a theatre of pain rather than clarity. Outside the palace, commoners heard tales of these rituals and laughed bitterly. Officials beat themselves, they said, but never for the people. To peasants, the spectacle was meaningless. Another example of elites playing games with their bodies while the poor bled in fields. Still, the stories spread, feeding both awe and cynicism. Some admired officials' bravery, others mocked their foolishness. Either way, the ritual became part of China's tapestry of shocking customs. The parallels with other practices are striking. Just as women bound their feet to display refinement, just as nobles grew nails to prove status, so too did officials bruise themselves to show humility. Each custom warped the body into symbol, feet crippled, nails elongated, voices silenced, faces battered, all in service to hierarchy. Ancient China's obsession with order and symbolism carved itself into flesh again and again. One anecdote tells of an official who, delivering particularly harsh criticism, struck himself so fiercely that he knocked out a tooth. Blood spilled down his robe as he continued to speak. The emperor, impressed, spared his life despite the offence. Later, other officials whispered enviously, as though the missing tooth were a medal of courage. It is almost comical. The imperial court, where promotions depended not only on scholarship, but on how convincingly you could knock yourself senseless. Over centuries, reforms tried to temper the practice. Some emperors insisted officials need only bow deeply instead of beat themselves. Others codified limits: 3 slaps for minor matters, heavier blows for major, but rituals are stubborn. Even when not required, many officials continue to bruise themselves out of habit or fear, unwilling to risk seeming arrogant. In their world, not bleeding could be as dangerous as bleeding too much. Eventually the custom faded with the fall of dynasties and the rise of new political orders. Yet echoes remain in cultural memory, where humility and self-denial still carry weight. The idea that suffering proves sincerity lingers in proverbs, in stories, in the expectation that leaders must bear scars to be trusted. Pain, once law, became metaphor. So picture it one last time: the throne room, vast and echoing, courtiers lined along walls, ministers kneeling in rows. A man steps forward, raises a stick, and strikes himself until his cheek blossoms red. Then, blood on his lips, he begins to speak. Every word is framed by pain, every sentence underlined by bruises. Around him, silence holds, broken only by the sound of flesh against wood. In this strange theatre, truth and loyalty bleed together, and governance becomes as much about spectacle as policy. Among all the shocking practices of ancient China, this one unsettles not for its gore but for its absurdity. It was cruelty inflicted not by rulers but by men upon themselves, a ritualized masochism born from fear and duty. And it shows, perhaps more than anything else, how far humans will go to prove their loyalty in a world where survival depends on suffering. The clang of wooden sticks fades, and now the rhythm of our journey begins to soften. We leave behind the throne rooms, the prisons, the graveyards, the pigsties, and all the unsettling customs that once seemed so normal in ancient China. Tonight, instead of blades and decrees, picture something gentler: the quiet sway of paper lanterns. Imagine them strung along narrow streets, glowing softly against the night, swaying in the breeze like drifting moons tethered to earth. Their light falls on tiled roofs, on cobblestones polished smooth by centuries of footsteps, and on faces weary from a day's survival. Lanterns were more than decoration. They were symbols of hope, guidance, and gentle continuity. In villages, families hung them outside their doors during festivals, not just to ward away darkness, but to invite blessings inside. A child chasing after his mother might reach up to touch the red paper globe, laughing as it swayed just out of reach. Couples walked beneath them in silence, their shadows blending in the glow. Elders sat quietly, watching the lanterns flicker and thinking of years long past. In their light, the harshness of daily life softened, if only for a few hours. After nights of shock and brutality, let your imagination linger here. You see families gathered by rivers, placing small lanterns onto water, letting them float downstream. Each carried a wish, a prayer, a memory. Hundreds of lights drifted together, turning rivers into glowing pathways, as though the spirits themselves had come down to walk among mortals. In that shimmering sight, fear loosened its grip. Even those who had endured the strangest of customs found comfort in the simple glow of paper and flame. Let the air feel gentler now. The shouts of markets and cries of punishment are gone. Instead, you hear only the rustle of silk sleeves, the laughter of children chasing shadows, the faint crackle of candle wicks. You breathe in smoke scented with pine resin and faint hints of roasted chestnuts from nearby stalls. For a moment, the Empire's chaos seems distant, softened into memory. You notice how lanterns turn even ordinary walls into stages of colour. Reds glow like warmth, golds shimmer like sunrise, whites flicker with purity. The night, which once hid fear, becomes tender and luminous. In these streets, silence is not punishment but peace. Every light whispers reassurance. There is still beauty here, still calm even in a world of cruelty. So let your shoulders relax, let your breath slow. The heavy stories of foot binding, mutilations and mercury fade into the background. They belong to the past, to memory, to history's ledger of strange and brutal norms. What remains in this moment is softness, the way flame dances inside paper, the way light trembles yet does not break, the way even the darkest sky can be pierced by something small and human. Perhaps that is the truest secret hidden among the shocks. People survived them. They found laughter, they found rituals, they found love, they found ways to endure. A farmer popping lice on his collar still told stories to his children by lantern light. A concubine, silenced by decree, still smiled at the moon from her window. A eunuch pacing the palace still hummed in his throat when no one listened. Amid cruelty, life went on, stubborn and gentle. So tonight, let those lanterns guide you too. Picture them swaying above your bed, glowing softly as you close your eyes. Each one carries not the weight of punishments or poisons, but the promise of rest. They light your path not through palace gates or battlefields, but into the quiet fields of sleep. Their glow whispers that history, however brutal, is behind you now, and only peace lies ahead. Let the river of lights drift further. Let them carry away the noise, the fear, the strangeness. You're not in a hall of mutilation, not in a courtyard of judgment, not in a palace of silence. You are here, in the calm glow of paper lanterns, safe and unobserved. The past is a story, the present is rest. So dim the lights around you. Feel the weight of your body sinking deeper, as if the earth itself cradles you. The lanterns float above, each one a soft reminder that even in history's darkest nights people found light. And so will you. Rest now. Let the stories slip away. Let your breath lengthen, your mind quiet. Sleep comes not as punishment, but as gift. The Empire's strange customs fade, and only the glow of lanterns remains, guiding you gently into dreams.